And with Joe McCarthy, the theme in everything we will talk about is whatever it took. He would do anything, and I repeat the word anything, to get elected and to hold on to power. And that meant switching parties, it meant switching by ideologies, and it meant holding up in your hand a list of spies that didn't exist and that he knew didn't.
And good evening, everybody. Welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, president of the Boston Public Library and your host for this evening and the series called The Arc of History, Contested Perspectives. We focus on figures and issues from history as a way of enlightening and illuminating issues of the day. And in our case, the historical context is very important, but often personal biography of a figure from history also helps illuminate our issues. And so I'm thrilled that tonight's program is a joint presentation between the Boston Public Library and American Ancestors NEHGS, as well as sponsorship from the Lowell Institute and production by GBH Forum Network. I'm joined this evening as co-moderator by Margaret Talcott from American Ancestors NEHGS. And we will be welcoming in a second our very special guest, Larry Tye. Margaret, welcome to the program.
David, thank you so much. Indeed, I'm the curator of the American Inspiration Author Series from American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. And the mission of our series is not so different from yours. We go back maybe a little further in time. The mission of our series is to connect you out there in the audience with history and also to provide historical context. Thanks to everybody for the library for welcoming us into this partnership. And there is so much to talk about related to the book tonight, Demagogue. I am really looking forward to joining the discussion later in the program. David, thanks again for including us, and back to you and to Larry.
Larry, welcome. Larry Tye is a New York Times bestselling author whose earlier works include biographies of Robert Kennedy and Edward Bernays. And we're also going local. From 1986 to 2001, Larry was an award-winning reporter at the Boston Globe, where his primary beat was medicine. Today, he also runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship, which helps the media do a better job reporting on critical issues like public health, mental health, and high-tech medicine. Larry, let's get started with a little introduction, if you would, to Joe McCarthy, one of the most reviled figures in American history of the 20th century, but also loved by quite a few too, interestingly enough. So I hope we get a chance to unpack that. But your previous work on Robert F. Kennedy, why did the world need another biography on the Kennedys? I understand that actually connects you ultimately to Joe McCarthy.
Yes, so I'd love to just give you a little bit of background on why I did this book. And you're too polite to say that the world really probably doesn't need the 51st biography on Joe McCarthy. And I want to tell you why I first thought about writing this. And it was when I was doing the biography on Bobby Kennedy. Of the 450 people I interviewed, there was only one who was truly essential, and that was a woman named Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow, and at the time that Bobby died, the most popular woman in America. And when I was asking her about Bobby's relationship with Joe McCarthy, she said something that years later came back to me. She said that Joe McCarthy might be a monster in the eyes of most Americans, but to the Kennedy family and to she and Bobby, he was just plain good fun. Now, those are words you don't often associate with Joe McCarthy, the idea of his being good fun. But I thought, number one, there is a side to Joe McCarthy that I don't understand, that I'm intrigued about. But I also realized that Joe McCarthy seemed like a story from our ancient past, and that we were, as a country, beyond the notion of creating demagogues in our modern world. And so a week before the 2016 election, I had signed up to write a biography of Barack Obama. And the day after the election, I realized two things. One, that we wouldn't know Obama's legacy for a long time. And the other was that what had seemed like a story of ancient history was looking more like a story of today. And there were three things that I was trying to tap into new sources of information about McCarthy that I was hoping was going to give me new insights. One were most people who know anything about McCarthy and about his role in the public realm remember the Army McCarthy hearings, maybe the most famous Senate hearings ever to that point, where in 1954, most of America was tuned in for months watching this guy on television and watching him go at it with the US Army. And there we can see Joe McCarthy. To his left, as we're looking at that picture, we see a guy who touched off much of that controversy, a guy named G. David Shine, a young aide. And to his right, we see the famous lawyer, the brilliant and arrogant Roy Cohn. And the hearings, the Army McCarthy hearings, it turns out were just a third of the hearings that McCarthy held when he chaired his subcommittee. And the other 2/3 were behind closed doors. And it is only very recently that the 9,000 pages of transcripts from those hearings became public. So I knew those were out there. An old pal who is the official historian of the Senate is the one who curated those. And he said, these transcripts, these hearings showed Joe McCarthy unhinged. So that had me intrigued. I knew there was also an extraordinary cache of papers at Marquette University, McCarthy's alma mater, that his widow had left 60 years ago and that biographers had been trying for 60 years to get. And one day I got an email from the archivist at Marquette, who I'm convinced was herself convinced that she would die without ever getting to see those papers opened up. And she said, to my shock and to your shock, the McCarthy family has agreed to let you have a look at all those personal and professional papers. Everything from his World War II diaries, to his love letters, to every office file that his office had ever put together. So those were two caches that I had. The third one was one day where I live on Cape Cod, my wife and I and the dog were going for a very early morning walk. And we saw at the head of our driveway an enormous brown box. And I had no idea what it was. And I decided we would continue with our walk and then come back later on and look at them. And that was the last group of papers that I had spent a year and a half begging for, had just told my publisher we weren't going to get. And that was all of McCarthy's medical records from Bethesda Naval Hospital, showing the conditions he suffered under, showing things about his addictions that explained a whole lot about his behavior. So the bottom line is, and I want to turn it over to you two now, the bottom line is, with all of those materials, if I couldn't write a book that said something new, shame on me.
That's amazing. And there are 600 pages of an incredible work for us all to peruse through at some point, including the footnotes and bibliography. So, you know, I can't imagine what the experience of going through all those papers would have been to get you to this point. But I think we have to understand what's the political and historical context out of which this figure emerges first. So if you would situate Joe McCarthy's rise for us. It's post-World War II. It's, you know, the Cold War has gotten going. He served in the military and then begins to try to run for public office. What's the context that, as you would describe it, which gives rise to this person who goes on to be the Senator Joe McCarthy?
So good question. And before I address that, I just want to say the picture we're looking at now is the picture of him during his World War II service on the South Pacific Islands. It's the picture that gave him the idea of taking on the moniker of Tail Gunner Joe. And that's a controversy we can talk about later on. But the context that McCarthy and his whole crusade began is that in 1950, when he launched this crusade, America had just watched nationalist China become Red China. We had watched the atomic spies, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, be captured and tried and convicted. We were seeing an extraordinary level of fear in what was going on at in the Soviet Union, The fear was enough that shortly after he launches his crusade, school children across the country would be taught what was known as ducking and covering, where they were told if an atomic explosion happened, they should duck for cover under their desks and put their hands over their head. And that was the kind of trauma that America was going in through that Joe McCarthy was tapping into. But one last thing that I want to note in terms of the historic context, all the 24-karat spies that we would uncover, spies like Julius Rosenberg, had already been uncovered. And for a full 12 years, the House Un-American Activities Committee and lots of other communist hunters had their hunts underway. So Joe McCarthy was tapping into a real fear. He was late to the battle, and he didn't have a whole lot of understanding about what any of this really meant at the time, other than it created an opportunity for him to make hay.
So we see really real fear dominating the national consciousness at the time, but then McCarthy, as he moves forward, starts demonizing all sorts of people that he decides are other, and this really allows him to have people get behind him. Would you talk a little bit about that progression and maybe give us along the way a little definition of demagogue as you're using the term in this context?
Sure. So can I start out by telling you a quick story on where he launched the crusade and why and how? And that was on February 9th, 1950. On the anniversary of Abe Lincoln's birth, Republicans all across America celebrate, and they celebrate generally by holding fundraisers. And if you're in a city like Boston or New York, Washington or San Francisco, you bring in a senator or a congressperson who really matters. If you are Joe McCarthy, you take any invitation you can get in 1950 because you're a backbencher who looks like he was on his way to a certain defeat when he ran for election in 1952. And the only place that offered him an invitation that year was what his staff referred to as Wheeling, West by God, Virginia. He goes to Wheeling, West Virginia, and brings with him a big suitcase for his big speech that night. And in his case, in his briefcase, are 2 speeches. And he doesn't decide until the last minute which one he's going to give. One was a speech that was on national housing policy, an issue he actually knew something about. And it was a snoozer of a speech. And had he picked that speech out of his briefcase that night, David, you and I wouldn't be here tonight 70 years later paying any attention to Joe McCarthy. But instead, he picked out of his briefcase a barn burner of a speech on a topic that he knew almost nothing about. And he waved in his hand that night a sheaf of papers saying, I have in my hand a list of 205 spies at the US State Department. They are people who are creating a hazard to our country. They're people that President Truman should know about and should have rooted out. And he realized that if you just made a general charge that there were traitors in the government, that would not get a whole lot of attention. But if you named the traitors and counted them, then you would get incredible attention. And within 2 days, Joe McCarthy was on the front page of every newspaper in America, and he was off and running, and he never turned back. The fact that what he had in his hand was something other than a list of 205 spies didn't matter. And in fact, the number kept changing. In the next week, when he was going out talking about it, it was sometimes 205, sometimes 57. 205 was a recycling of a lot of old lists that many of whose signatories, many of the people on that list were no longer working at the State Department, never had been communists, not to mention spies. When he turned to his other big number, 57, some friend of his speculated, and I think this is as logical as anything else, that on the way to giving the speech where he first used the number 57, he stopped off to have a steak, which he loved. He used the Heinz 57 sauce, and that number jumped out at him. And that was as logical as any other reason for the numbers he was coming up with. But he was off, he was running, and he had done a brilliant job at tapping into American fears, and you ask what the word demagogue means, I want to tell what demagogue means in the context of Joe McCarthy and this crusade that he was launching. It means understanding Americans and what they are worried about. It means offering them a solution that is so simplistic that they know, and anybody who thoughtfully considers it realize won't really answer Americans' fears. And it means taking off and with your main concern being arousing the population to pay attention to you and to keep you on the front page of every newspaper in the country. And he did that. He was not the first to do that. America has a deep strain of demagoguery from Huey Long and the Jew-baiting radio preacher from Michigan named Charles Coughlin, all the way up to Joe McCarthy and continuing to today. What was different about Joe McCarthy is he did it for longer and more effectively than anybody who had come before, to the point where he became the archetype for every bully and demagogue that followed.
And, you know, we associate him with the Republican Party now, but he first ran as a Democrat. And whether these are actually Republican or Democratic values of the time, I think is a question, or is in fact it more of an opportunistic approach to simply getting elected, simply going after power, and using the fear of the population at the time for his own ends.
Yes. So you mentioned that he was a Democrat. He was not just a Democrat. When he first ran for district attorney, he was an FDR-loving, New Deal, liberal Democrat. But he quickly realized that in rural Wisconsin, you'd never get elected dog catcher as a Democrat. So some night, probably after midnight when nobody was looking, he went and changed his party affiliation. And he didn't just become a Republican, he became the standard bearer for the most conservative part of the Republican Party in Wisconsin. They were known as stalwart Republicans. And with Joe McCarthy, the theme in everything we will talk about is whatever it took. He would do anything, and I repeat the word anything, to get elected and to hold on to power. And that meant switching parties, it meant switching by ideologies, and it meant holding up in your hand a list of spies that didn't exist and that he knew didn't.
And he seems to find, compatriots or partners in crime that will, further his cause. There's a moral equivalence that Dees, the Texas Democrat, who was one of the first chairmen of the committee, wanted to pursue these evils on both the right and the left and never did. There's David Schein, who you've mentioned, and then I do want to get to Roy Cohn, because there's a through thread with him that just becomes doubly interesting.
Yes, so that is absolutely true that he was enabled by lots of people. And I'd love to tell you, I think that is almost as important as who Joe McCarthy was, is who in the country made Joe McCarthy possible. You start out with the easiest. You start out with the people who bankrolled him. And that was a lot of wealthy people, but mainly Texas oilmen, who saw him as representing all of their political values. And we can see from his private records the kinds of big checks that they cut. And these were the most important people in the oil industry in Texas in the 1950s. And he played such a role with them that the press in Texas dubbed him the third senator from Texas. It was members of the Senate, his colleagues in the Senate. The Democrats didn't want to take him on because they had watched the first Democrat who stood up and tried to take him on, a guy named Millard Tydings from Maryland. They had watched McCarthy orchestrate a campaign to take on and defeat this very powerful senator. And that sent a message to Democrats across the country: beware of the Joe McCarthy bulldozer. Republicans didn't want to take him on, first because when they were in the minority in the Senate, they didn't want to threaten their chances to get into the majority. And when they made it into the majority in 1953, they had a slim enough margin that they weren't about to sacrifice one of their own, Joe McCarthy, and risk losing their majority. The other set of enablers that is troubling to me as a lifelong journalist were the press enablers. They realized that Joe McCarthy was great copy. They realized that they could get on page one and stay on him, and they became his megaphone. One last political enabler that I want to mention, and he was what I call the enabler in chief. He was Dwight Eisenhower. From the day Eisenhower was elected in 1953, the day he took office in 1953, his brother Milton, a very smart university president, was whispering in Dwight's ear, saying, Joe McCarthy is a bully. You've got to give up some of your enormous popularity and take him down. And Eisenhower ignored that advice. He agreed that McCarthy was a bully. He felt that the best way to take him on was to let him take himself down. And that was strategically true. McCarthy eventually did take himself down, but in the interim, in the time from the moment I took office to the time that Joe McCarthy started to evaporate, thousands of people lost their jobs, millions of people were silenced, and a handful of people actually lost their lives. And that was a toll that I put on the doorstep of Dwight Eisenhower. And I don't want to take any more time with this question other than to say the real enabler and the one that is most troubling to me is us. It is the American people, and we are ultimately the ones who let Joe McCarthy happen, who saw his popularity numbers skyrocket, and who waited 4.5 long years before we saw the light and realized that he was in fact the fraud and the hoax that Millard Tydings had dubbed him as.
I mean, I'm glad you've talked about the press role and particularly his relationships, not just with the press, but also with a variety of either presidents or presidential figures, because that seems to illustrate what McCarthy spotted as a resource or a gap or an opportunity for him to take advantage of. And in not getting challenged by either people, by press, or indeed by these presidential figures, whether, you mentioned Eisenhower, but there are others there as well. He continues for 5 years, 7 years, which is an amazing amount of time to do an awful lot of damage.
It is, and he understood perfectly how to play the press. I talked about that first speech where he launched his crusade in Wheeling, West Virginia, and it wasn't just because that was the only place he was invited on February 9th that he thought that was the perfect place to launch it. It was also because he understood if he gave that same speech in Washington, the journalists who were covering him would have experience at the State Department and in the White House and in all the places McCarthy was pointing his finger. They would know just who to call for comment, and that comment would make it in that first day's story. If you're out in Wheeling, West Virginia, you have one reporter from the local paper and one reporter from the Associated Press who are there covering what you're doing. They have no idea, especially on deadline, who to call in Washington. And so the comment makes it on page 24 of the second day story, but in the first day story, you're all alone on page 1. He also understood if you waited and gave your speech over a dinner, that deadlines would be looming and there'd be no chance to really call and ask for any kind of other input to your story. He understood that if he stayed for a week out in burgs like Wheeling and Reno and all these communities across the country, which had no real press coverage, that everywhere he went, he'd be able to control the agenda. He understood that you curried favor with reporters and charmed them when you could, that you attacked them when the news was bad, and he knew just the rules of the media in a way that might remind people of more contemporary figures, but was also a brilliant way of turning the rules of the press onto themselves. I want to just say one more quick thing about the press. If there is a single journalist in American history who gets credit for bringing down Joe McCarthy, it is Edward R. Murrow, the star of a famous movie called Good Night and Good Luck, and Murrow is seen as the McCarthy slayer. Well, Murrow himself admitted that he was years late to the game. And if there's one journalist in America who really deserves credit for taking on Joe McCarthy when he was strongest and for suffering the most for doing that, It is a columnist who today nobody will remember, but in his day was the most widely read columnist and radio broadcaster in America, a guy named Andrew Drew Pearson.
And what can you tell us about Andrew Pearson's approach?
So his approach was, in the month after the Wheeling speech, he wrote 60 scathing columns attacking Joe McCarthy and calling him a fraud, saying, where are your numbers? Where are your names? For that courage and for being out there as the lone wolf taking on McCarthy, Pearson suffered in two ways. One way was that McCarthy ran into him one night at a dinner at a posh Washington dinner club, and he accosted Pearson in the hat check room. And had it not been for a famous Quaker peacemaker named Richard Nixon, who stepped between the two of them, Drew Pearson would have been beaten to a pummel. The other thing that happened to Pearson was McCarthy wisely and cynically went after Pearson's radio sponsor, a company called Adam Hats. And he basically said to his enormous following, stop buying Pearson hats until Pearson Hats gets rid of Drew Pearson. Well, Pearson Hats said conveniently, we've decided for reasons having nothing to do with Joe McCarthy, we're going to drop our sponsorship of Drew Pearson, fooling nobody, killing Pearson's sponsorship. He never had as lucrative a deal ever again in his career. And again, McCarthy was sending a signal. It wasn't just Pearson he cared about. It was every journalist in America who might be tempted to attack him the way Drew Pearson did.
I want to go into two more questions and then bring Margaret in for a little bit more of the personal biography and a few other questions. But we glossed over the Roy Cohn role. And so he is another figure that looms large once you start peeling back the layers of the onion from this period of American political history. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Joe McCarthy, Roy Cohn, and I understand, I think there was reference to there's a Cohn-Kennedy conflict that was happening in and around this time as well.
Yes, so Joe McCarthy at the beginning of 1953 becomes a member of the majority party. The Republicans give him the chairmanship of this powerful subcommittee, permanent subcommittee on investigations, and he needs a staff director, a chief counsel. And he brings in two people who he's considering for the job. One is a brilliant, arrogant lawyer from New York who had a record of prosecuting communists, and his name is Roy Cohn, and the other is Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy's qualifications for the job were that Papa Joe Kennedy had given enough money to Joe McCarthy that when Joe Kennedy called Joe McCarthy and said, hire my son, McCarthy said yes. And he went back and forth who should be the boss and who should be the number two. He ended up giving the job to Roy Cohn, who went on to reinforce every bad instinct Joe McCarthy had. As Bobby Kennedy visually set the scene, he said, Roy Cohn took McCarthy up an enormous mountain, and with no brakes, he sent him down on the toboggan. And that was what life was like. It was incredibly thrilling watching this collaboration of Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn until they crashed at the bottom. History can only wonder what that experience of Joe McCarthy's chairmanship would have been like had he hired Bobby Kennedy instead of Roy Cohn. And years later, Roy Cohn said to Bobby Kennedy, I did you this enormous favor. You would never have become the liberal icon that you became had you had the affiliation with Joe McCarthy that I did. And instead, you could leave, you could blame it on me, and you could sort of get away with that and make your transformation from Joe McCarthy Cold Warrior to ultimate liberal American icon. So we then fast forward 50 years, and Roy Cohn, who is Joe McCarthy's protege, becomes the tutor for a youngish guy who is just entering the cutthroat world of New York real estate named Donald Trump. And Roy Cohn passes on to Donald Trump every important lesson that he learned from Joe McCarthy. And I'll just mention two of them. That when one of your manufactured charges is exposed as hollow, the next day lob a fresh bombshell. When you think that somebody might attack you, attack them before they do and kick them as low and hard as you can. That all of these lessons that McCarthy fine-tuned and became the definition of McCarthyism, Cohn was passing on to anybody who would listen, and passing on especially to Donald Trump, who did listen.
Yeah, the through threads to today, I think, are something we will need to pick up on in a little bit later in the program. If you would, for those watching and listening, just characterize his own undoing, because it's almost like he continues to go after, you know, different groups, demonize them, accuse them of you know, all sorts of behavior, being communists, suggesting it's not just at the State Department, but ultimately within the U.S. military. The rhetoric is laced with anti-Semitism, anti what we call anti-gay or anti-LGBT work. The suggestion that it's pink homosexual communist agenda that's providing, but it gets too far. What's the reach that really is McCarthy's undoing?
So his undoing is taking on an enemy that was too big to bully, and that enemy was the U.S. Army. At the end of 1953, he started pointing fingers at a base in New Jersey called Fort Monmouth, this incredibly important command and control center for all the armed services. McCarthy said was riddled with nests of communist moles. And he pointed fingers. Initially, the Army bent to him and said, we'll suspend people, we'll investigate everybody you tell us. And finally, the Army and finally the Commander-in-Chief, Dwight Eisenhower, said, we've had too much. And the Senate calls a set of hearings, the famous Army McCarthy hearings. At the beginning of those hearings, fully 1 in every 2 Americans, 50% of Americans, thought Joe McCarthy was doing a great job. And to put that number into context, that made him the 2nd most popular politician in America, trailing only Dwight Eisenhower. In the course of those hearings, anybody who remembers their school book definition of the Army McCarthy hearings, they were hearings that very dramatically featured a lawyer who worked not far from where you're sitting there, David, a guy named Joe Welch, a smart leprechaun-like Boston lawyer who raised a famous question in the middle of the hearings: Senator, have you no sense of decency? When McCarthy attacked his young associate. The truth was, by that time in the hearings, the gig was up for McCarthy. Americans had watched this guy that they started off seeing as their hero look on their TV screens like a town bully. And that's what Joe McCarthy was. So by the time Welch asked his question, all of America wanted that question asked. By the time the hearings were over in August of 1953, that Gallup poll 50% had shot down to 34%. And you watched what happened to the enablers, whether it was Dwight Eisenhower or McCarthy's fellow senators. When they saw how unpopular he had become, they suddenly developed a backbone. By December, the Senate had censured him, and essentially from December of 1954 to 1957, when McCarthy died, his political career and his friendships with just about everybody in Washington were over.
Thank you. For those watching and listening, whether live or later in the recording, just want to draw your attention to the chat, which has more information about the topics we're discussing, and also reminds you that you can pick up a copy of Larry's book from your local library or from your local independent bookstore, and a special relationship with Trident bookstores enables us to have Larry personalize your very own copy. And now, back to Margaret Talcott.
That was fascinating. I so enjoyed it, and I've been charged with taking us back to Wisconsin. I heard that loud and clear. We just want to sort of start at the beginning. You know, Joe's life was really quite remarkable. I mean, he's the 5th of 7 children. He's an offspring of Irish and German immigrants. His grandfather made his way to Ireland from Ireland to Wisconsin's Fox River Valley in the mid-1800s. He shot his way through high school in 1 year, I think it was. Can you just tell us a little bit, how did he get all the way to being a senator at the age of 39? You know, what happened in between there?
Sure. So Margaret, I love going back there, and especially given your expertise, and we're going back and looking at family and how important and how defining that was for Joe McCarthy. And he, as you said, came from a wonderful stock of Irish, German farmers in Wisconsin. Nobody in that family ever dreamed that one of the offspring would go on and have his name, take his name into becoming an ism. Joe McCarthy finishes the 8th grade and he decides that's all the education he needs. And he goes out and develops this mini empire of hens. He develops a flocks of hens that had the leading poultry magazine in America label him the boy chicken tycoon. And it was incredibly successful. Thousands of hens. He was taking their eggs and taking them to market. And then a virus. And viruses have become a little too common in our lexicon, but a virus swept through his flock of hens, killed all the hens, and he takes his entrepreneurial skills from poultry to a little 7-Eleven kind of store called Cashway. And there are a series of these across Wisconsin. And Joe McCarthy, within a couple of years, makes his store the most successful by far of anywhere in that mini empire. But at age 20, he finally says, it's time to get a high school degree. I want to go further than this, and I need some sort of education. So as a sign of just how smart he was, a lot of people look at Joe McCarthy and say, he was a bully. He doesn't look like a very smart guy, waving his finger around the way he did. In fact, he was really smart, and he finished 4 years of high school in a single year. He went through Marquette University, first studying engineering and then law, but in fact doing very little studying and just going to review sessions. He picked up enough, quickly enough, to make it through easily. And one last thing, and I want to just tell a very quick story about his first political race he ran in when he was in college. And this to me set the template for Joe McCarthy and everything he would do after that. He was running for president of his law school class. And he was running against a really affable guy named Charlie Curran. And the two of them agreed in what they call the gentleman's rules of this election, which were we're each going to vote for the other, because that's the way gentlemen would do things. Well, the election ended up in a dead tie, and in the second round, Joe McCarthy won by 2 votes, his vote and Charlie Curran's vote. And Curran was outraged, and he said, how could you do that? And McCarthy, in classic explanation, said, look, I was telling everybody to vote for the best man, and I convinced myself, and you wouldn't want me to vote for somebody who wasn't the best man for this seat. And Curran hated him, but he hated him. The story normally stops there, and Curran's hatred dissipated. And it dissipated because not long after that election, Charlie Curran's father died. Joe McCarthy first found a way to get Curran on a quick train to be there for the funeral. Then McCarthy borrowed a car and borrowed money for gasoline and showed up at that funeral. Charlie Curran was so touched that when journalists over the years came to him and said, what about that nasty McCarthy who cheated you out of the class presidency, Curran would only tell the good side of what Joe McCarthy would done. And that is the reason McCarthy had this charming side. Charlie Curran saw it, Ethel and Bobby Kennedy saw it, and the voters in Wisconsin saw it twice, which is why they overwhelmingly elected Joe McCarthy as their U.S. Senator.
You have not mentioned this a remarkable family, is it La Follette family of Wisconsin, which he went on to go up against. They were sort of the reigning senators, in a dynasty family. You said that their name was as good as royalty and that there was a sort of a magic to them. And they were sort of his first combatant to get to the Senate floor. And just, looking at this issue of family dynasties and political leadership, Joe McCarthy ran across many of them. He certainly, was with the Kennedys. You mentioned the Bushes in the book. La Follette was his original, who he went up against with. Dynasty families must have been very irksome to him based on who he was. But tell me, where does he land on that? Nixon also hated the Kennedys, part of McCarthy early on. There's a real push me, pull you on that, and some of it started in Wisconsin.
So it did. And in fact, Joe McCarthy loved taking on the La Follettes because he knew that a family as dynastic as them would generate precisely the headlines, not just in Wisconsin, but across the country, if he could take down Robert La Follette Jr. And as you say, the La Follettes were to Wisconsin, what the Kennedys were to Massachusetts, what the Tafts were to Ohio. They were big, they were powerful, they felt like that was their family seat in the Senate. And McCarthy came out of nowhere to take down, he convinced a wing of the party in Wisconsin called Stalwart Republicans, the very conservative wing of the party, that he should be their standard bearer. He took on La Follette on a campaign that was partly legitimate upfront issues, like whether La Follette was captured by the Washington establishment, he had spent so many years there, whether he was old and tired, which he was, but also whether he was living in an estate in Virginia that he owned, which he wasn't. He took on issues that captured the sense for McCarthy that if you tell small lies, you can turn them into big lies and you pay no bigger price. And if you tell lies against your political opponent, they will only be exposed late enough that people will forget the exposing of the lie and they will remember as part of the narrative of the candidate the story you tell about them. And he redefined this very famous guy, La Follette, for the electorate in that Republican primary in Wisconsin, and it worked, and he beat La Follette, and he went on and had an even easier race against the Democrat. And so he showed up in Washington in January 1953 with two things to his name. One is he may have been the least qualified person to show up and take a seat in the Senate at that point. His only real office had been as a circuit judge in Wisconsin, but he also showed up as the titan who had taken down Bob La Follette, and that meant a lot to people in Washington.
Another thing that seemed to mean a lot was his Catholic faith to him and to how he made connections across Washington and sort of where he stood, particularly vis-a-vis the Kennedys and the power base that he got. Is it fair to say that religion gave shape to his politics? It was sort of an amazing time when religious conservatism was connected more to the Catholic Church than to any other religion at that time. You had William F. Buckley, you had Father Coughlin, and was the Catholic lay political identity different at that time, certainly than now?
So yes and no. The yes is that clearly the strongest base of his support was in the Catholic community, and there was a very large Catholic community that years later would help Jack Kennedy get the nomination and win the presidency. There was a large Catholic community in Wisconsin, and Catholic voters were always his strongest base of support. On the other hand, to his credit, Joe McCarthy played down. His faith meant a whole lot to him. I saw in his private papers that he was giving to Catholic causes around the world that nobody would ever know about. And he was devout in his religion, but he never played it in a way that lots of politicians do to try to touch certain strings in the Catholic community. He knew he would get Catholic support anyway, partly because he was a Catholic and partly because the Catholic world back then were among the strongest supporters of the anti-communist movement. One last place that McCarthy's being a Catholic played arguably even more of a role than in Wisconsin for him was in our state of Massachusetts. And this is when Jack Kennedy was first running for office. He was an upstart congressman. He decided to take on the powerful Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. And Lodge was debating about bringing Joe McCarthy into the state because he knew in a heavily Catholic state like Wisconsin that bringing in a fellow Republican and a Catholic like McCarthy could help him. That was when Papa Joe Kennedy got involved. And he said to Joe McCarthy, I don't expect you to come to Massachusetts and campaign for my son Jack because you're a Republican and he's a Democrat, and you could never do that. He said, all I ask of you is stay the heck out of Massachusetts. Joe McCarthy listened to that. He stayed out of Massachusetts. And for the rest of his life, much as Jack Kennedy found a lot of fault with Joe McCarthy, Jack Kennedy never took on Joe McCarthy. Jack Kennedy never voted for McCarthy's censure or even said how if his back hadn't been ailing him, how he would have voted. And Jack Kennedy never showed much of a profile and courage in his relationship to Joe McCarthy. And that was because he owed a big piece, I think, of his election to Senate to Joe McCarthy. Eisenhower won Massachusetts in 1952 by 9 points. Jack Kennedy won by 3 points, and Joe McCarthy could have been enough to take away those 3-point margin.
You and I spoke previously, Larry, about the importance of families in creating this biography, that there were so many folks who were so abused by McCarthy, and that they did come forward. You pursued them, the families of the victimized, those who jumped out of windows, those who took their lives with sleeping pills. He ruined so many lives. I mean, you do give a full count of really how many lives were ruined, and that those family members have come forward and given you tales. Did you think you'd be landing in a family drama when you started to do this research? And how inspiring that folks set the record straight.
Yes, and so this is not just because you come from a group where families are front and center in what you do. Families played 3 critical roles in what I was doing with this book. Number one, I mentioned that McCarthy's family, for whatever reason, decided to open his papers to me to let me tell fully his story. The second, as you mentioned, was in a chapter that I called Body Count, looking at the people who were Joe McCarthy's targets and victims and what had happened to them. And I could come up with nearly a dozen whose suicide we could connect directly to Joe McCarthy and whose family members I talked to about that, including the son of Bob LaFollette, the ex-attorney general of Wisconsin named Bronson LaFollette, who talked about the fact that his father shot himself because he thought, the son thought, with convincing evidence, because he was about to be called before Joe McCarthy's subcommittee and grilled on what he had done as a senator. So that element of family, the family of the victims, was important, but so was the family of McCarthy himself and his collaborators, his staff, his friends, his colleagues. And they were incredibly generous in giving me access to unpublished memoirs and other papers of their family members. So it wasn't just McCarthy's enemies, it was his friends who helped give me insight into these 2 sides, this 2 sides of Joe McCarthy's personality, the charming one and the sinister one. And none of that could have happened without families opening those doors.
So fascinating. I really appreciate these answers. And David, I think that we've got some questions from the audience. Do you want to kick us off with?
Certainly, if you don't mind my starting with one of my own as well, because we're talking about family here, and one gets a sense from the book that Joe's relationship with his second wife, Jean, is incredibly strong. And so, Larry, I'm just wondering if you would talk a little bit about that relationship as part of this, and then also, you know, if he were to read this book, this chapter called Body Count, what would his take be on this now?
So first, Jean. Jean was his assistant. Jean was courted by him, and all the telegrams and letters that he sent are there in his records and tell a fairly romantic story that this guy, who could be tough as hell when he was grilling witnesses, was really knew just the chords to pull in this woman who was considerably younger than him and considerably more eligible, I thought, to get her to come around. And when she finally did come around, she started out, anything that I saw in the files that had Joe McCarthy's name on it, that was written like a writer, was really eloquent. I presumed, and I'm totally convinced that I'm right, that Jean wrote. Jean also left behind a book called, an unpublished book called The Joe McCarthy I Knew, which gave wonderful sense of this guy as seen by his adoring but smart wife. And by the end, when America had fallen out of love with Joe McCarthy, the 2 truest believers in McCarthy and McCarthyism were Joe and Jean McCarthy. And very sadly, at the very end of his life, when he was drinking himself to death, and alcohol played a major role in everything from his hearings to his actual cause of death, when he was dissipating, Jean saw that the one thing that could pull him out of that was their having a baby, and they couldn't have a baby on their own, and they adopted a baby. And this happened shortly before Joe died, it was the one thing that took him out of his depression and that had him staying sober more often than he'd been able to for a while. And they fell in love with this infant baby, and there was real potential, and Gene saw that, for them to truly get a new life together, but they had waited too long. And in the medical records that we see at Bethesda Naval Hospital, we see that the official coroner's cause of death, which was repeated by every journalist in the world, was that he died from acute hepatitis. He in fact died of the effects of alcoholism. The last days of his life, when he was going through the DTs, were recounted in stunning detail by a clerk for the military who stood by Joe's bedside for the last 2 days of his life, recording everything that happened. I'm convinced because they knew this ultimate orchestrator of conspiracy theories would become the subject of what had really killed him, and there were conspiracy theories that he had been murdered. Well, in fact, we know everything that happened to him for the last 2 days of his life and until he died, and it was a very sad story. And I forget the other half of your question. It was
really a second question. I apologize for doing that.
Sorry,
but
that was
what would he think if he were to read, in particular, the chapter, The Body Count?
So we know what he would say because he said it every time somebody charged him with being responsible for something bad that happened to somebody. And he would always say, that's not true. They did it to themselves. And you proved to me one person whose life I really made worse. Well, I would like to offer him the extra proof that I think is in the book in a compelling way, showing that people kill themselves because of him. And I would like to say that it was not just the people who killed themselves or the people whose careers we can point to, but it was the hundreds of thousands and maybe millions for years after that that couldn't raise the word communism or socialism or maybe even liberalism without having a taint left by McCarthy and McCarthyism.
So I'll pick up the first question from our audience, which moves us 70 years later to today, and goes under that column of lessons to be learned. The question from Richard is, what elements, if any, of Joe McCarthy's approach to communism do you see reflected and not reflected in Donald Trump's approach to governance?
So that's a perfect segue from the question we were just talking about. And I think that everything that Joe McCarthy did to make it unacceptable to call anybody a legitimate, the patriotic leftist remains today. That it is assumed that if you point a finger at somebody and call them, you don't have to call them a socialist, you just call them a flaming liberal. And certainly you don't have to call them a communist. It remains, that taint remains. And I'm convinced that that is partly the reason that Jack Kennedy tried to prove himself as a strong anti-communist in the early months of his taking office and got us into the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. Everything that I saw in Bobby Kennedy suggested they were trying to show that you could be a Democrat and an anti-communist. And I think if you actually, the irony in all of this is if you go back and ask the anti-communists of McCarthy's era, who did more damage to their movement than anybody, it was Joe McCarthy. Because people assumed that when you were using the charge of somebody being a spy, after Joe McCarthy, the assumption was it was scandalous. It was a reckless accusation. And somebody told me in the course of doing the research that if Joe McCarthy had been dropped into the middle of Red Square on May Day, he would never have been able to pick out a communist. And that may be going a bit far, but the truth is that Joe McCarthy was the last one to know who was a real spy and who was a recycled name.
I mean, it is particularly interesting to see both China and Russia getting either demonized or adored in current American geopolitics, which in itself is a callback to that time. The next question, and I'll throw it to Margaret after this one, could you expand on Bobby Kennedy's role as second chair and his relationship with Joe McCarthy? And this question comes from Joe.
Yes. So a lot of people, including people in the Kennedy family, have said that Bobby Kennedy went to work for Joe McCarthy because he needed a job at that moment, that he stayed for a very short period of time, and that it was only worthy of an asterisk in his career. And I think that's myth making. And I think that Bobby Kennedy went to Joe McCarthy, as Bobby himself said many times, because he believed that Joe McCarthy was the one person in 1950s America who was standing up and pointing fingers at the real communists who were behind pillars at the State Department and at the White House and other places. He went to work for Joe McCarthy because he believed in him. He stayed for 5.5 long months because he continued to believe in him. And when Joe McCarthy died in 1957, and all the Republicans from Washington flocked to his funeral, Jack Kennedy pointed his finger at Bobby and said, "You will not go to that funeral." Jack was plotting already for his run for the White House, and he knew that it would be an embarrassment to him if his kid brother showed up at Joe McCarthy's funeral. Well, Bobby defied his brother. He showed up at the funeral, and on the one hand, he hid up in the choir loft during the funeral. And at the graveside service, he went off to the side where all the dignitaries are here. He was way over here. And after the graveside service, he went up to all the reporters that he recognized there and begged them not to get him in trouble with his big brother Jack. Would they please leave his name out of their stories? And one of those reporters, half a century later, talked to me as part of his mea culpa for leaving Bobby's name out of the story, said, "I did it, and I watched everything Bobby did there." And Bobby had it both ways there. On the one hand, he was protecting Jack by staying out of the stories. And on the other hand, he was showing just how much he cherished his relationship with Joe McCarthy by showing up at McCarthy's funeral and staying his friend till the very end.
He clearly inspired great loyalty and love among a certain segment of folks. I mean, he had 50% of the country snowed or in love with him before those Army hearings. We have some personal questions here from the audience. Why did my parents believe Joe was a saint? They were Boston Irish Roman Catholics. Why are so many people devoted to him? This is a different person whose name I don't have. My 6th grade teacher was one of those people. And I mean, I love the story of him knowing the name of every elevator operator in the Senate building, you know, that he was a real personable guy. Does that, but surely that doesn't explain the two questions I just brought up.
Yes. So I want to start by just saying a personal note. If I could have gone out for a beer with Joe McCarthy, I would have given anything, even though he was somebody who by the end I realized was even more sinister than I thought he was. He was an extraordinary raconteur. He told stories, he charmed people. He would take somebody and destroy them during the day at a congressional hearing, and at night invite them out for a drink. Because to him, it was all a game. And if he understood the rules of the game, you knew that he was an old boxer. And he understood that after you got out of the ring with somebody, you'd shake their hand and you could be their friend. And that was the way Joe McCarthy saw politics and saw life. And for whether it was your mother for the first questioner or your 6th grade teacher, I think it was, their falling in love with Joe McCarthy was understandable. America was afraid back then. Joe McCarthy seemed to be offering a compelling answer. America had a lot of ancient, weaselly-looking politicians, and Joe McCarthy was somebody who went to Washington and who looked like he was going to clean up the city, drain the swamp, do all of these things that he promised his constituents in Wisconsin and the country that he would do. He made a compelling storyteller. He made a compelling case for himself. And half of America, it would be more unusual if your mother or your 6th grade teacher, given what the poll numbers looked like, had not liked him, even though today everybody says, "Oh, I was a Joe McCarthy critic from day one." Well, that simply can't have been true. It was like everybody who was a Red Sox fan during all the years they were losing, and when they finally won.
So we have this fascination then, I think, with demagogues. You know, we seem to, as a nation, put our trust in people who are charismatic, regardless of what the facts on the ground tell us. We've looked at this 7-year period where McCarthyism really takes hold. It is his undoing. We've mentioned Roy Cohn as one person who keeps McCarthyism going. And, you know, I want to use this question from Raymond, who says, how involved then was Roy Cohn in transferring McCarthy's style, and this is a great phrase, amoral opportunism to Trump today? And it may be it's enablers around him. It may not be just the current president.
So I want to just for a second talk about Roy Cohn and that word amoral. There's nobody in American history, maybe even including Joe McCarthy, who strikes me as more clearly amoral than Roy Cohn showed himself to be when he was by Joe McCarthy's side. Roy Cohn, as we know later, was gay. Roy Cohn, as we knew then, was Jewish. Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn were America's #1 gay bashers back then. Joe McCarthy and I think Roy Cohn were pointing at such disproportionate numbers of Jews in their search for communists that the Anti-Defamation League came out and said something smells wrong here. And the idea that Roy Cohn could become a fig leaf for McCarthy, trying to fend off his charges of anti-Semitism and be a collaborator in going after not just communists, but gays, suggests two things to me. One is that morality didn't matter, and the other is that he went after groups that he knew would not have defenders that mattered to their base. Easy targets, gays, Jews, pinkos in the State Department. How important was he as a tutor to Donald Trump? All I can say is I wasn't there when he was giving him all of these sessions in the 1980s when Trump was about to jump into this cutthroat world of New York real estate. I do know that every time Donald Trump has gotten in trouble as president, he has said, I wish I had Roy Cohn either at my side or protecting my backside. And I think that he's telling us just how important Cohn was. The truth was, it was really his mentor's mentor that he should have been saying was important, but too controversial to say, I wish I had Joe McCarthy at my side. So instead you say, I wish I had Roy Cohn here.
I have a question from Margaret Heights, who says, I mean, there were people who were onto him, and this is one of them, I guess. Could you talk about the Joe Must Go recall campaign in Wisconsin and the small town newspaper editor who started it?
So it was an incredibly courageous editor, Lester Gore or Leroy Gore, maybe it was Leroy Gore, who started this campaign. He had started out like most of Wisconsin, thinking McCarthy was a pretty good guy. He came to see him as a fraud. He started this recall effort to gather enough signatures to put Joe McCarthy out of office. And it came close to getting enough to get it on the ballot. It failed, but it showed that by that point, McCarthy was in trouble. And that was somewhere, I can't remember if it was 1952 or 1953, but it showed vulnerability there. And I wish that his enablers like Eisenhower and his fellow senators had looked to the courage, but also to the incredible groundswell of opposition that was developing to McCarthy, had looked to it when that campaign was going, because they might have brought Joe McCarthy down a year or two earlier than they did.
Yeah, it was no time. I mean, no time was too soon for that. There were some other fabulous New England characters in your book. Senator Flanders from the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont was one of the first to sort of strike a blow at him in '54. And then Senator Watkins, Utah, a Mormon elder. I mean, how did these guys finally wake up? I mean, there was the civility comment, of course, by Joe Welch, and sort of the bullying by Ray Jenkins at his side. But, you know, it took a lot to bring him down. It looks like New England and the Mormons factored into that.
So there were actually, that's really interesting, because there were more New Englanders who took on Joe McCarthy than from any other region of the country. And I just wrote a piece for the Yale Alumni magazine, because it turns out there were more Yale alumni who took him on than from any other school in America. And I want to just talk about two of those senators from New England, because I think their story is emblematic. One was a woman from Maine named Margaret Chase Smith, the only woman in the Senate at that time. And she was a pal with Joe McCarthy at the beginning, but after his speech in Wheeling, she realized this just doesn't make sense, and he's being abusive of witnesses and of fellow senators. So she penned what was called a Declaration of Conscience, and that was a document that she got 6 fellow Republicans to sign on to. And on the way to delivering that, she ran into Joe McCarthy at the elevator, and she said, hello, Joe, I'm going to say some things. I'm not going to name you by name, but you're not going to like them. And he reminded her that he was the guy who was touting her as a possible vice presidential nominee with Dwight Eisenhower or whoever the nominee was going to be in 1952. She delivers that speech on the Senate floor attacking McCarthy. After she did that, it was trademark Joe McCarthy. First, it was name calling. Smith had gotten 6 GOP members to sign on with her. McCarthy dubbed her Snow White and the 6 Dwarfs. Then he went after her in Maine and got a Republican to go up against her, take her on from her right flank, and he brought in all kinds of money and all kinds of dirty tricks, and it didn't work. She won, but she won by a narrower margin than she had in the previous election. There was another, but today, the last piece of the Margaret Chase Smith story is, if we remember her for anything today, and this to me says something for people who have the courage to take on demagogues in any era, if we remember her for anything, it is for her declaration of conscience against Joe McCarthy. So she took grief for it at the time, but today that is part of her legacy, and it is part of why another senator today from Maine named Susan Collins looks to Margaret Chase Smith as her role model because of the way she took on Joe McCarthy. And Susan Collins, ironically, was the senator who chaired the same subcommittee that McCarthy ran and opened up those 9,000 pages of transcripts so that people like me could look at them and read what happened behind closed doors. The other fascinating senator to me from Vermont was the one that you mentioned, Ralph Flanders, an old guy, a very smart guy, and the first guy to take on Joe McCarthy. It was his issuance of a series of talking points against Joe McCarthy that became the basis for the articles of impeachment, the articles, I'm sorry, of censure that were brought against him. It was him who had the courage to take on McCarthy again before just about anybody besides Margaret Chase Smith. And it was Flanders who McCarthy slandered by saying they ought to get a net and capture that guy and take him off somewhere quiet. McCarthy could never just deal with the substance of the remarks. He had to, his names were incredibly entertaining, but they were incredibly mean. And Flanders had the courage not to back down.
Well, I love that, New England Yankee spirit. What you talk about for Joe is, he had a real outlaw spirit to him. As part of that sort of naming of victims and naming of who he would go after, that he was a real, Western bad dude in many ways, and that he really brought that out in folks.
He was a cowboy, and and your word is perfect. He was an outlaw cowboy.
And it worked in Wisconsin. It really worked for him there. Going back to a question here from Matthew Gauthier. Has your research for this book given you any insight on how much or how little the American public's relationship to communism has changed since McCarthy's time?
So I assumed, again, naively, I assumed that we had outgrown demagogues, and I assumed that we had outgrown knee-jerk anti-communism, especially because communism in the world today is so much less of a threat, that our biggest communist nation is an incredibly effective capitalist nation in China. And the Soviet Empire is no more. And yet today, I think is a leftover, not just of the generalized Red Scare, but of Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism. It has changed a whole lot less than I thought it had and that I think it should have. And I think that we've sort of taken off the table a whole set of issues that we can't discuss in this country for fear of having a finger pointed and saying we're a socialist. And that's why it took as long as it did, I think, to get a universal healthcare system in America. And that's why even today, it's very difficult to discuss anything in terms of government healthcare in half of the country.
Although there are, there are no more card-carrying communists anymore, are there?
Right. So there were, Joe McCarthy's favorite phrase was card-carrying communist. And the last thing a real communist would have done is ever carried a card saying they were a card-carrying communist. And I think that that was a wonderful phrase that nobody ever stopped and examined back then. And certainly today, you could probably carry a card around. There would be a lot fewer people doing it. And the whole notion of communism posing any threat domestically in America is pretty ridiculous.
Can you tell us a little bit? A question came in about Adlai Stevenson and those amazing elections of, was it 52 and 56, where Dwight D. Eisenhower in a landslide beat him. Where was McCarthy in all of that? And where did he side? I mean, clearly Dwight D. Eisenhower was sort of on his side slightly, but a little bit about Adlai.
Sure. So every time that McCarthy in that 52 campaign, every time McCarthy mentioned Stevenson, he would make what he said was a slip of the tongue and call him Alger Stevenson, trying to conjure up the image of the accused spy Alger Hiss. And McCarthy needled Stevenson in a way that when I interviewed Stevenson's son, who himself had been a senator from Illinois, 50 years later, it still hurt. And it hurt. Adlai Stevenson was really smart. He was incredibly witty, but McCarthy's attacks against him were so much lower than anything that Stevenson had ever had to face, including looking at his sexual preferences, including looking at any issue that he knew would appeal to the public, would scandalize Stevenson, and it sure as heck didn't have to be true.
I have one more of my own questions I'd like to throw in. One of the bridges too far related to book burning and attacking libraries. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this, given where I'm seated here in the heart of the Central Library at BPL at Copley Square. What on earth was this about?
So I love that view there. I love seeing it. Reminds everybody how eager we are to get back into wonderful reading rooms like that. And Joe McCarthy sent I don't know if any of any people tuned in tonight will remember who the Katzenjammer kids were, and they were cartoon characters, and they were what Roy Cohn and David Schein were characterized by as the press. When Joe McCarthy sent them off in 1953, I think it was, to investigate the Voice of America and our overseas libraries around the world. And Schein and Cohn rented lavish hotel rooms and had a blast everywhere they went. But they also took a blast at libraries, and they looked at the shelves. They found any book that they could come up with that was written by a slightly leftist author. They insisted that the State Department supported libraries remove those books. And it was reported in the New York Times and somewhere else that in at least one case, books were actually burned. And the truth was, across the country, there were book burnings going on, symbolically sort of burning leftist tracts to show that certain communities didn't have communists. And the notion, McCarthy denied that he was responsible for any book burnings, but he certainly created an atmosphere that all of this stuff was ready to be ignited before Joe McCarthy came along. He lit the flame that set the country on fire. The Red Scare predated him, but there is a reason why the movement, the anti-communist movement of that time, was not called Dyeism, even though Martin Dies, for 12 years before Joe McCarthy came along, had been running the House Un-American Activities. It was not called Trumanism, even though Harry Truman had a loyalty program that investigated every one of 5 million employees or applicants for federal jobs. It was called McCarthyism because even though he was late to the hunt, Joe McCarthy captured that spirit and took things 5 steps of irresponsibility beyond what anybody had ever done before. And so nobody even knows who Martin Dies is today. And Harry Truman, we think, is the good guy whose buck stopped here. but in fact, he in a way set the table for Joe McCarthy.
A great segue into a question from Mikhail Go, if I'm pronouncing their name correctly. The House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, they actually continued without Joe McCarthy until about the 1960s under Joe Tavener. Did you look into that period? Is someone else going to look at publishing information on those hearings? What are your thoughts on that aspect of things?
So my thoughts are, if there were 50 good books on Joe McCarthy before I came along, there were probably 100 on the House Un-American Activities Committee and all the blacklisting, and there were great movies that exposed all of the things that were going on with that. And while I discussed that as part of the historical context that led to McCarthy's era and version of the Red Scare, I think that I was trying to stay away because I think there's extraordinary confusion. Everybody attributes Joe McCarthy, attributes the blacklist to Joe McCarthy, and attributes the Hollywood 10 and all the things that went on with that. Joe McCarthy had his very unique era, and he actually is one of the few people in history who could make the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, look rigorous and entirely above board because his were so irresponsible.
If I could just step back and look at some of your past work related to this book, and also, you know, sort of where you're headed. I mean, you've been looking at larger than life American figures, you know, iconic Bobby Kennedy, Satchel Paige, Superman, you know, there's a through line here. And you know, where are you going from here? Can you talk to us about that?
So I can, and I won't bore you with too much about it, but I want to say the title of my next book, which I'm deep into now and is facing a too soon deadline, is called The Jazzmen, Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. And it is my reward to myself and my publisher's reward to me for having spent nearly 3 years with a dark character like Joe McCarthy. I can tell you, the sitting down every day to research these extraordinary jazz maestros is about the most joyous antidote to McCarthy and McCarthyism. But I want to say one last self-serving thing, which is my book about Joe McCarthy is in fact a good news story. It's about one of the most sinister characters in American history, but the good news element is that with Joe McCarthy and with every other demagogue in American history, given the rope, they hung themselves. And Joe McCarthy, to me, is an uplifting story that while America bought into him for much longer than we should have, eventually we recognized our better nature, and Joe McCarthy plummeted.
Is there a particular additional lesson you'd like to leave us with as we think about how the press was used, how politicians sometimes are opportunists rather than idealists? What are the lessons that you want us to take away from your analysis of Joe McCarthy, his life, and his legacy?
So one lesson is that when we really stop and pay attention to what these bullies or demagogues are doing, if we use some of the same standards we do in our anti-bullying campaigns on the playground and just say there's a certain kind of behavior that we won't accept in our kids' playmates or in our politicians, that we have the power to stop this. But the other is a self-serving message for my two collaborators on tonight's program. I want to say that the protection against McCarthy and McCarthyism is doing the kind of wonderfully rich and true family histories that Margaret and her organization do. It is having institutions like public libraries where people can go and study history and come up with the true stories, the true versions of these things that we call fake news today. We can tell what's real and what's true. But the other, to me in a way, and this is coming from where I came from as a lifelong journalist, I don't want to make journalists into saints because they're clearly not, and they weren't in the McCarthy story. But it was journalists who helped not only raise McCarthy into power, but bring him down. And whether it is our collaborator tonight, WGBH, or any other kind of media, we've got to hold the media to high standards, but recognize they are the ultimate protections of democracy and against demagogues. And we can't, even with great resources like your organization, Margaret, and like the Boston Public Library, we can't all go in there and study and expose everything that a liar is telling us in a public arena, but we can support journalists who are out there doing that as their daily mission.
Larry, thank you so much for bringing us this work and for bringing us Joe McCarthy in all his humanity, as well as his legacy for our time today. We have certainly shared a great conversation, and we hope that viewers and panelists will take up on some of our viewers and listeners take up our suggestions for where to get a copy of this book for themselves. Great read, very, very enlightening. Margaret, thank you so much for joining me to co-moderate tonight's panel and for stepping in when we had a little technical difficulty. Thanks to you and to American Ancestors by New England Historical Genealogical Society. Thank you for joining us this evening. See you next time.